The grand courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people filled every available seat. Golden sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. At the center of it all sat Princess Isabella, barely 16 years old, her small frame almost swallowed by the ornate wooden chair. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. The court proceedings had been going on for 3 hours now. Lawyers in expensive suits argued back and forth about inheritance laws and royal succession. Isabella's uncle, Lord Reginald, sat across the room with his team of advisors, occasionally glancing at her with cold, calculating eyes. He had been trying to claim the throne ever since Isabella's father, the king, had died in a mysterious accident 6 months ago. Isabella felt completely alone in the room full of people. Her mother had passed away when she was just a baby, and now with her father gone, she had no one to protect her. The lawyers spoke in complicated legal terms that she barely understood, but she knew enough to realize they were deciding her entire future. If her uncle won this case, she would lose everything: her title, her home, and possibly even her life. The young princess had always been observant, a trait her father had encouraged. Even as a child, she noticed things others missed: the way servants whispered in corners, how certain nobles avoided eye contact, the tension that filled rooms when important discussions took place. Today, that same awareness told her something was terribly wrong. Her uncle's main lawyer, a thin man with piercing eyes named Mr. Blackwood, was presenting documents that supposedly proved Lord Reginald had a stronger claim to the throne. Isabella had never seen these papers before, and something about them seemed off. The handwriting looked too new, the paper too clean for documents that were supposedly decades old. But when she tried to speak up, her own lawyer quickly shushed her, telling her it wasn't appropriate for her to interrupt. That's when Isabella noticed Captain Marcus standing guard near the main entrance. She had known him since she was a little girl. He had been one of her father's most trusted royal guards. Marcus was a tall, strong man in his 30s with kind eyes and a gentle smile that he always saved for her. Unlike many of the other guards who treated her formally, Marcus had always been like a protective older brother. During her childhood, Marcus had taught Isabella a secret sign language that he had learned during his military training. It was originally designed for soldiers to communicate silently during dangerous missions, but Marcus had shown it to Isabella as a fun game. They would use it to send messages across crowded rooms during boring royal ceremonies, making faces at each other when no one was looking. Isabella's father had known about their little game and had approved of it. He believed it was good for Isabella to have someone she could trust completely, and he respected Marcus for treating his daughter with genuine care rather than just royal protocol. The king had often said that Marcus was the kind of man he hoped Isabella would surround herself with as she grew older, people who valued her as a person, not just as a princess. Now, sitting in this courtroom where she felt like everyone was against her, Isabella remembered those simpler times. She watched Marcus carefully, hoping he might notice her distress. He stood perfectly still in his dark blue uniform, his hand resting on his sword, eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. The golden buttons on his jacket caught the sunlight, and the royal crest on his chest reminded Isabella of better days when her father was alive, and she felt safe. The court session continued with increasingly heated arguments. Mr. Blackwood presented witness after witness who claimed they had knowledge of secret agreements between Isabella's grandfather and Lord Reginald. Each testimony seemed designed to paint Isabella's father as someone who had stolen the throne illegally, making her claim invalid. Isabella's own legal team seemed overwhelmed and unprepared. They fumbled through their responses, often looking confused by the evidence being presented against them. The head judge, an elderly man with a stern expression, appeared to be growing impatient with the proceedings. Isabella could see that things were not going well for her case. As the afternoon wore on, Isabella became more and more desperate. She realized that the adults who were supposed to protect her were either unable or unwilling to fight for her properly. Her uncle sat smugly in his chair, occasionally whispering to his advisors and nodding approvingly when the testimony went in his favor. The young princess began to understand that this trial was not really about justice or legal rights. It was about power, and her uncle had clearly spent months preparing for this moment. He had witnesses, documents and lawyers all working together to take away everything that rightfully belonged to her. But Isabella was not ready to give up without a fight. Her father had taught her to be brave and to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. He had always told her that being royal meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and right now she needed to protect herself. Looking around the courtroom, Isabella realized that Marcus might be her only hope. He was the only person in the room who truly cared about her well-being rather than political gain. If she could somehow communicate with him and let him know what she suspected about the forged documents, maybe he could help her find a way to prove the truth. The challenge was getting his attention without alerting anyone else to what she was doing. The courtroom was full of people watching her every move, waiting to see how the young princess would handle this pressure. Any obvious attempt to communicate with Marcus would be noticed immediately and might even hurt her case further. Isabella took a deep breath and tried to remember all the hand signals Marcus had taught her over the years. She would have to be very careful and very clever about this. Her entire future depended on whether she could successfully reach out to the one person in the room who might be able to help her fight back against her uncle's schemes. The late afternoon sun continued to shine through the windows, but Isabella felt like darkness was closing in around her. She knew that the next few moments would determine whether she would remain a princess or lose everything she had ever known. With her heart pounding in her chest, she prepared to make her move. Isabella waited for the perfect moment when most eyes were focused on the lawyers arguing at the front of the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood was dramatically waving a document in the air, claiming it proved beyond doubt that Lord Reginald was the rightful heir. The judge and most of the audience were watching his performance intently. Slowly and carefully, Isabella positioned her hands in her lap where only Marcus could see them if he happened to look in her direction. She began with the sign for help, a simple gesture where she pressed her palm against her chest and then extended it slightly forward. It was subtle enough that anyone else would think she was just adjusting her posture. Marcus, trained to be aware of everything happening around him, caught the movement in his peripheral vision. When he turned his head slightly to look at Isabella, she repeated the sign more clearly. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he recognized the signal they had used so many times during boring palace functions. Isabella continued signing, her movements small and careful. She signed uncle by pointing discreetly toward Lord Reginald, then lying by touching her nose briefly, a sign Marcus had taught her years ago. Then she signed papers by miming holding a document, followed by fake by shaking her head slightly. Marcus understood immediately. His face remained professionally neutral, but Isabella could see the concern in his eyes. He had always been able to read her expressions, and now he could see the genuine fear and desperation she was trying so hard to hide from everyone else. The royal guard's mind raced as he processed what Isabella was telling him. He had suspected something was wrong with this whole trial from the beginning. Lord Reginald had appeared too confident, too prepared, as if he knew exactly how everything would unfold. The documents being presented had seemed suspicious to Marcus as well, but as a guard he had no legal standing to question them. Marcus had served the royal family for over 15 years. He had started as a young soldier and worked his way up through dedication and loyalty. Isabella's father had trusted him completely, often asking for his advice on security matters and sometimes even personal issues. The king had specifically asked Marcus to watch over Isabella if anything ever happened to him. The memory of that conversation now felt prophetic. It had taken place just 2 weeks before the king's fatal accident. The king had seemed worried about something, though he never explained what. He had pulled Marcus aside after a routine security briefing and said, "Promise me that if anything happens to me, you'll protect Isabella. She's going to need someone she can trust." Now Marcus understood that the king might have suspected his own brother was planning something. The accident had seemed strange from the beginning. The king was an experienced horseman, yet somehow his horse had spooked and thrown him into a rocky ravine. The official investigation had been brief and inconclusive, but Marcus had always felt there were too many unanswered questions. While maintaining his professional stance, Marcus began to think about what he could do to help Isabella. As a royal guard, he had access to certain areas of the palace that others did not. He also knew people in various government offices who might be able to help verify the authenticity of documents, but he would have to be very careful not to overstep his authority or make his suspicions known to the wrong people. Isabella continued to watch Marcus hopefully, seeing that he understood her message. She signed tonight by pointing down and then making a subtle circular motion with her finger, indicating they should meet later. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming that he understood. The court proceedings continued around them, but now Isabella felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't completely alone after all. Marcus had always been someone she could count on, and knowing that he believed her about the forged documents gave her the strength to sit up straighter and pay closer attention to what was happening. Mr. Blackwood was now calling his final witness of the case, an elderly man named Professor Edmund Sterling, who claimed to be an expert on royal genealogy and inheritance law. The professor walked slowly to the witness stand, using a cane and wearing thick glasses that made his eyes look unnaturally large. Professor Sterling spoke in a dry, academic tone about ancient laws and precedents. He explained how, according to his research, the throne should pass to the eldest male relative when there were questions about the direct line of succession. He claimed that Isabella's grandfather had made secret agreements that would make Lord Reginald the heir instead of Isabella's father. As Isabella listened to the professor's testimony, she noticed something odd. The man kept glancing at Lord Reginald as if looking for approval or guidance. Real experts usually focused on the judges and lawyers when giving testimony, not on the people who might benefit from their statements. Isabella also noticed that Professor Sterling's explanations seemed rehearsed, as if he had memorized exactly what to say. When Isabella's lawyer asked challenging questions, the professor seemed flustered and often looked to Mr. Blackwood for help before answering. The young princess began to realize that this was all an elaborate performance. Her uncle had probably spent months finding people who would say whatever he needed them to say, regardless of whether it was true. The documents, the witnesses, even this so-called expert. It was all part of a carefully planned scheme to steal her inheritance. Marcus was thinking along similar lines as he watched the proceedings. He had seen enough military operations to recognize when something was coordinated in advance. Everything about Lord Reginald's case seemed too perfect, too convenient. Real legal cases usually involve some uncertainty and contradictory evidence, but everything being presented supported Lord Reginald's claim exactly. The guard also noticed that several of the people supporting Lord Reginald were strangers. In the close-knit world of royal courts, most faces were familiar, but Marcus didn't recognize many of the witnesses, or even some of the advisors sitting with Lord Reginald. This suggested that the uncle had brought in outsiders specifically for this purpose. As the day's session finally came to an end, the judge announced that they would reconvene the next morning to hear closing arguments. Isabella's heart sank as she realized how little time was left. If Marcus was going to help her prove that the documents were forged, they would have to work quickly. Lord Reginald stood up with a satisfied smile, clearly confident that victory was within his grasp. He nodded to his legal team and began making his way toward the exit, surrounded by his supporters. As he passed Isabella's chair, he leaned down and whispered, "You should have accepted my offer to step aside quietly, my dear niece. Tomorrow you'll lose everything." Isabella kept her face calm, but inside she felt a new determination growing. Her uncle's arrogance had just reminded her of exactly why she needed to fight. This wasn't just about her own future anymore. It was about preventing a cruel and dishonest man from gaining power over the entire kingdom. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Isabella caught Marcus's eye one more time. She signed library and midnight, indicating where and when they should meet. Marcus nodded slightly, confirming their secret appointment. The real battle was just beginning. That evening, Isabella sat in her chambers trying to appear normal while her mind raced with plans. Her lady-in-waiting, Mrs. Pembridge, fussed around the room, preparing Isabella's nightclothes and chattering nervously about the day's events. The older woman had served the royal family for decades and was clearly worried about what would happen if Lord Reginald won the case. "Your Highness, you must try to eat something," Mrs. Pembridge said, gesturing toward the untouched dinner tray. "You'll need your strength for tomorrow." Isabella forced herself to take a few bites of bread and soup, knowing that Mrs. Pembridge was right. She also knew that she couldn't involve the loyal servant in what she was planning to do. The fewer people who knew about her meeting with Marcus, the safer everyone would be. "I think I'll read for a while before bed," Isabella said, hoping to give Mrs. Pembridge a reason to leave her alone. "Something to help me relax." Mrs. Pembridge nodded approvingly and finished her preparations. After wishing Isabella good night, she left for her own quarters down the hall. Isabella waited 20 minutes to make sure the woman wouldn't return for anything forgotten. Then she quietly changed from her nightgown back into a simple dark dress. The palace halls were dimly lit by occasional oil lamps, creating long shadows that would help conceal her movement. Isabella had grown up in these corridors and knew every secret passage and shortcut. As a child, she had often played hide-and-seek with the servants' children, learning all the best hiding spots and quiet routes through the building. Moving silently through the corridors, Isabella made her way toward the royal library. It was located in the oldest part of the palace, where the stone walls were thick and the rooms were naturally quiet. The library had always been her favorite place, a vast room filled with thousands of books, comfortable reading chairs, and tall windows that looked out over the palace gardens. Marcus was already waiting when she arrived, standing near one of the tall bookshelves in a section devoted to historical records. He had changed from his formal guard uniform into plain clothes, making him less recognizable if anyone happened to see him. When Isabella entered the room, he immediately moved to check that the door was properly closed behind her. "Your Highness," Marcus said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you told me today. If those documents are really forged, we need to find proof quickly." Isabella nodded, grateful that Marcus was taking her seriously. "I know they're fake, Marcus. I've seen my grandfather's real handwriting many times. He wrote me letters every year on my birthday until he died. The writing on those papers doesn't match at all." Marcus's expression grew more serious. "That's a good observation, but we'll need more than just your word to convince a court. Do you know where any examples of your grandfather's genuine handwriting might be stored?" Isabella thought for a moment. "There should be official documents in the royal archives. Letters, proclamations, things like that. But the archives are kept locked and only certain people have access." "I might be able to help with that," Marcus said. "As a senior guard, I have access to most areas of the palace for security purposes. But we'd have to be very careful. If we're caught, it could make things worse for you." The young princess looked at Marcus with determination. "Things are already as bad as they can get. If we don't do something, I'm going to lose everything anyway. At least this way we have a chance to fight back." Marcus admired her courage. Despite being only 16 and facing such enormous pressure, Isabella was thinking clearly and willing to take risks to defend herself. It reminded him of her father, who had always been brave in the face of danger. "All right," Marcus agreed. "Let's go to the archives. But we need to have a plan for what we're looking for and how we're going to use it." They spent the next hour planning their strategy. Marcus knew that the royal archives were organized chronologically, with the most important documents stored in fireproof cabinets. They would need to find examples of Isabella's grandfather's handwriting from around the same time period as the documents being used against her in court. Isabella remembered that her grandfather had signed a major trade agreement with a neighboring kingdom about 20 years ago. The document had been celebrated as one of his greatest diplomatic achievements, and copies were definitely stored in the archives. If they could compare the signature and handwriting from that agreement with the papers Lord Reginald was using, the differences should be obvious. The archives were located 2 floors below the library, in a section of the palace that was rarely visited except by scholars and government officials. Marcus led the way, using his knowledge of the guard patrol schedules to avoid areas where they might encounter other people. The archive room was larger than Isabella had expected, with rows upon rows of filing cabinets and document storage boxes. The air smelled of old paper and leather, and dust particles danced in the beam of the small oil lamp Marcus had brought. "The trade documents should be in this section," Marcus whispered, leading Isabella to a cabinet marked with dates from 20 years ago. The cabinet was locked, but Marcus had brought tools that allowed him to open it without causing damage. Inside, they found dozens of folders containing official correspondence, treaties, and proclamations. Isabella's heart raced as she carefully examined document after document, looking for her grandfather's handwriting. Finally, she found what they were looking for: the original trade agreement signed by her grandfather in his distinctive flowing script. "This is it," Isabella whispered excitedly. "Look at how he makes his letters. See the way he crosses his T's and how his signature swoops at the end? It's completely different from those papers Uncle Reginald showed in court. Marcus examined the document carefully, comparing it in his mind to what he remembered from the courtroom. Even to his untrained eye, the differences were obvious. The handwriting in court had been much more angular and modern-looking, while the genuine document showed the elaborate calligraphy style that was common among educated people of her grandfather's generation. "You're absolutely right," Marcus said, "but now we need to figure out how to prove this to the court. We can't just steal this document, and we can't exactly explain how we got access to it." Isabella had been thinking about the same problem. What if we could get someone official to examine both documents? Someone who's an expert in handwriting analysis? Marcus nodded slowly. That might work. I know a man named Dr. Harrison who works for the government examining questionable documents. He's helped solve cases involving forged wills and fake contracts. If we could get him to look at both sets of papers, but would he agree to help us? Isabella asked. And would the court accept his findings? Dr. Harrison is completely honest. He only cares about the truth, not about politics. If we can convince him to examine the documents, he'll give an accurate assessment regardless of who it helps or hurts. And his reputation is so good that the court would have to take his findings seriously. Isabella felt a surge of hope. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she might actually have a chance to fight back against her uncle's schemes. But she also knew that they still had to be very careful about how they approached Dr. Harrison and presented their evidence. "How do we contact him without alerting my uncle?" Isabella asked. Marcus smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I have ways of reaching people quietly when necessary. But first, let me make copies of some key details from this document, so we have something to show him." Working by lamplight, Marcus carefully copied sections of her grandfather's handwriting, paying special attention to the signature and distinctive letter formations. Isabella watched nervously, aware that every minute they spent in the archives increased their risk of being discovered. Finally, they had what they needed. Marcus carefully returned the original document to its proper place and locked the cabinet again. As they prepared to leave the archives, Isabella felt both excited and terrified about what the next day might bring. Their secret mission had been successful, but now came the even more dangerous part, using what they had learned to expose Lord Reginald's fraud without revealing how they had obtained their evidence. The next morning arrived with gray clouds covering the sky, matching Isabella's nervous mood as she prepared for what could be the final day of the trial. Mrs. Pembridge helped her dress in a formal blue gown that had belonged to her mother, hoping it might remind the court of the royal family's dignity and history. Marcus had left the palace before dawn to meet with Dr. Harrison. The handwriting expert lived in the old quarter of the city, in a small house filled with books and scientific instruments. Marcus had known him for several years through his work with the palace security team, and he trusted the man's integrity completely. Dr. Harrison was a thin, elderly man with sharp eyes and steady hands that came from years of examining fine details in documents. When Marcus arrived at his door with copies of the handwriting samples, the expert immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. "These are very interesting," Dr. Harrison said, adjusting his magnifying glass to study the writing samples more closely. "The differences are quite obvious once you know what to look for. The supposed historical document shows clear signs of modern penmanship. The letter formations are consistent with someone educated in current writing styles, not the elaborate calligraphy that was standard 20 years ago." Marcus felt relieved that his and Isabella's instincts had been correct. "Would you be willing to testify about this in court?" "I know it's short notice, but the trial concludes today." Dr. Harrison nodded seriously. Forgery is a serious crime, especially when it involves matters of inheritance and royal succession. I have a professional duty to present the truth when I encounter clear evidence of document fraud. While Marcus was meeting with Dr. Harrison, Isabella sat in her chambers trying to eat breakfast despite her nervous stomach. She kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong with their plan. What if the court refused to hear new evidence? What if her uncle somehow discredited Dr. Harrison? What if their nighttime visit to the archives was discovered? Mrs. Pembridge noticed her anxiety and tried to offer comfort. "Your Highness, you must have faith that justice will prevail. Your father was a good man, and everyone who truly knew him understood his character. Surely the court will see through any deception." Isabella appreciated the woman's kindness, But she knew that good intentions wouldn't be enough to win against her uncle's carefully planned scheme. Everything depended on whether Marcus could successfully bring Dr. Harrison to court and whether the judge would allow the expert to examine the disputed documents. By mid-morning, people were again filling the courtroom for the final session. Lord Reginald arrived looking confident and relaxed, clearly expecting an easy victory. He wore his finest clothes and was accompanied by even more supporters than the day before, as if he was already celebrating his success. Isabella entered the courtroom with as much dignity as she could manage, despite feeling like her heart might beat right out of her chest. She looked around for Marcus but didn't see him at his usual post by the door. Her worry increased when she realized that if Marcus wasn't there, their plan might have failed. The judge called the session to order and announced that they would begin with closing arguments. Mr. Blackwood stood up to present Lord Reginald's final case, speaking eloquently about the importance of following historical precedents and honoring ancient agreements. He painted Isabella as a young girl who was understandably emotional about losing her father, but who needed to accept the legal reality of her situation. Isabella's lawyer gave a much weaker closing argument, focusing mainly on emotional appeals about Isabella's youth and the tragedy of her situation. He failed to effectively challenge any of the evidence that had been presented against her, and Isabella could see that the judge was not impressed by his presentation. Just as the judge was preparing to announce his decision, there was a commotion at the back of the courtroom. Marcus entered, followed by Dr. Harrison and two official court clerks who were carrying examination equipment. "Your Honor," Marcus said respectfully, "I apologize for the interruption, but Dr. Harrison here has some urgent information about the documents presented in this case. He is a certified expert in handwriting analysis and document authentication." Lord Reginald immediately stood up in protest. "This is highly irregular. The evidence period has closed. You cannot allow new testimony at this point." The judge looked annoyed by the disruption, but was clearly intrigued by the possibility of expert analysis. "Dr. Harrison, what exactly are you proposing to examine?" Dr. Harrison stepped forward with professional confidence. "Your Honor, I have reason to believe that some of the historical documents presented in this case may not be authentic. With your permission, I would like to conduct a brief examination using scientific methods to verify their age and authenticity." The courtroom erupted in excited murmurs. Isabella felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. This was their chance, but it was also an enormous risk. If Dr. Harrison's examination somehow failed to prove what they believed, it could actually strengthen her uncle's case. Mr. Blackwood frantically argued against allowing the examination. "This is clearly a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable decision. These documents have already been accepted by the court." But Isabella's lawyer, finally sensing an opportunity, stood up to support the examination. "Your Honor, if there are questions about the authenticity of key evidence, surely the court has a duty to investigate thoroughly." The judge considered the situation for several long minutes while the entire courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, he made his decision. "Given the serious nature of this case and its implications for royal succession, I will allow Dr. Harrison to conduct a preliminary examination. However, this must be done quickly and without disrupting the proceedings further." Lord Reginald's face turned red with anger, but he couldn't openly object without appearing to have something to hide. He whispered urgently to Mr. Blackwood, clearly trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected development. Dr. Harrison set up his equipment on a table near the judge's bench and began examining the disputed documents under magnification. He used special lights and chemical tests that could reveal the age of paper and ink. The courtroom watched in fascination as he worked with scientific precision. Isabella held her breath as she watched the expert examine each document. Marcus stood quietly nearby, ready to provide additional information if needed. The young princess could see her uncle becoming more and more agitated as the examination continued. After 30 minutes of careful analysis, Dr. Harrison straightened up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I have completed my preliminary examination and I'm afraid the results are quite disturbing." The judge leaned forward with interest. "Please share your findings with the court." Dr. Harrison held up one of the documents that had been central to Lord Reginald's case. This document, which purports to be 20 years old, was actually created within the last few months. The paper stock is of a type that was not manufactured until recently, and the ink contains chemical compounds that were not available 20 years ago. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom. Lord Reginald jumped to his feet, his face now pale instead of red. "This is impossible." "Those documents came from my private family collection," Dr. Harrison continued calmly. "Furthermore, the handwriting style is inconsistent with the calligraphy standards that were common 20 years ago. The letter formations and pen pressure indicate someone trying to imitate an older writing style, but lacking the proper training." Isabella felt like she might faint with relief. Their desperate plan had worked. Dr. Harrison had confirmed exactly what she had suspected about the forged documents. The judge's expression grew very serious as he absorbed this information. "Dr. Harrison, are you stating definitively that these documents are forgeries?" "Yes, Your Honor. In my professional opinion, these documents were created recently with the intent to deceive. This constitutes clear evidence of fraud." The courtroom exploded into chaos as people realized what this meant. Lord Reginald's carefully constructed case was falling apart before everyone's eyes, and Isabella finally had proof that her uncle had been trying to steal her inheritance through deception and lies. Lord Reginald's face went through a series of expressions: shock, panic, and then desperate anger. He began shouting accusations at Dr. Harrison, claiming the expert had been bribed by Isabella's supporters. "This is a conspiracy," he yelled. "Someone has paid this man to lie about my family's historical documents." The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to the chaotic courtroom. People were talking excitedly among themselves. Reporters were scribbling notes frantically, and several of Lord Reginald's own supporters were looking at him with suspicion and disappointment. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said sternly to Lord Reginald's lawyer, "do you have any explanation for these findings?" The lawyer looked completely flustered. It was clear that he had believed the documents were genuine and had no idea his client had provided him with forgeries. "Your Honor, we had no reason to question the authenticity of documents provided by Lord Reginald from his personal collection." Dr. Harrison stepped forward again. "Your Honor, if I may, I would like to present additional evidence that I discovered during my examination." The judge nodded for him to continue. "While examining the forged documents, I found traces of a particular type of ink that is only sold by one specialty shop in the city. The shop keeps detailed records of all purchases because this ink is quite expensive and unusual. I took the liberty of checking with them this morning." Dr. Harrison pulled out a receipt from his briefcase. "According to their records, this specific ink was purchased just 6 weeks ago by someone using the name R. Sterling, which I believe refers to Professor Edmund Sterling, who testified yesterday as an expert witness for Lord Reginald." The courtroom gasped again. Everyone remembered the elderly professor who had seemed so knowledgeable about royal genealogy. Now it appeared that he had been directly involved in creating the forged documents. Isabella looked around the courtroom for Professor Sterling, but the man was nowhere to be seen. He had apparently decided not to attend the final day of the trial, perhaps knowing that his deception might be discovered. Lord Reginald was now shouting even louder, claiming that he was being framed by his enemies. But his protests only made him look more guilty, especially when several people pointed out that Professor Sterling had clearly been working for him. The judge called for a brief recess to consider this new evidence. During the break, Isabella finally had a chance to speak privately with Marcus. "Thank you," she whispered to him. "I don't know how you convinced Dr. Harrison to help us so quickly." Marcus smiled slightly. "Dr. Harrison is a man of integrity. When I showed him the handwriting samples and explained the situation, he immediately understood the importance of uncovering the truth. He actually stayed up most of the night doing preliminary research to prepare for today." Isabella felt overwhelming gratitude toward both men. "What happens now? Will this be enough to stop my uncle?" "I think so," Marcus replied. "But we need to be prepared for him to try something desperate. Men like Lord Reginald don't give up easily when they're cornered." Marcus was right to be concerned. During the recess, Lord Reginald was having heated discussions with his remaining supporters. Many of them were clearly distancing themselves from him now that evidence of fraud had been revealed, but a few loyal allies remained. When the court session resumed, the judge addressed the situation with grave seriousness. "Based on the expert testimony we have heard today, it appears that this court has been presented with fraudulent evidence. This is not only illegal, but represents a serious attack on the integrity of our legal system." He turned to look directly at Lord Reginald. "Sir, you are now under suspicion of attempting to defraud the royal succession through the use of forged documents. I am ordering an immediate investigation into these charges." Lord Reginald stood up one more time, his face filled with rage. "You are all fools. That girl is not fit to rule. She's just a child who knows nothing about leadership or politics. I was trying to save this kingdom from disaster." His outburst only made things worse for him. By admitting that he had been trying to save the kingdom, he was essentially confessing that he had been willing to use illegal methods to achieve his goals. The judge's expression grew even more stern. "Your motivations are irrelevant, Lord Reginald. If you believed Princess Isabella was unfit to rule, there are legal procedures for addressing such concerns. Forgery and fraud are never acceptable, regardless of your personal opinions." Isabella felt a strange mix of emotions as she watched her uncle's desperate behavior. She was angry about his attempts to steal her inheritance, but she also felt sad, seeing how his greed and ambition had led him to destroy his own reputation and future. The judge then made his official ruling. Based on the evidence presented, and particularly the expert testimony regarding document forgery, I find that Lord Reginald's claim to the throne is based on fraudulent evidence. Therefore, I hereby dismiss his case entirely. He turned to Isabella with a more gentle expression. "Princess Isabella, as the legitimate daughter of our late king, you are the rightful heir to the throne. This court recognizes your claim and rejects all challenges based on the forged documents presented by your uncle." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers. Isabella felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally lifted from her shoulders. She looked over at Marcus, who was smiling proudly, and mouthed "thank you" to him. But Lord Reginald was not finished yet. As court officials began approaching him to discuss the criminal charges he would face, he suddenly reached into his coat and pulled out a small dagger. The blade glinted in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "If I cannot have the throne legally, then there will be no throne at all," he shouted, lunging toward Isabella with the weapon raised. The courtroom exploded into screams and chaos as people scrambled to get out of the way. Isabella froze in terror, unable to move as she saw her uncle rushing toward her with murder in his eyes. But Marcus had been watching Lord Reginald carefully throughout the proceedings, expecting exactly this kind of desperate action. The moment he saw the dagger appear, the royal guard was already in motion. He threw himself between Isabella and her uncle, drawing his own sword in one fluid movement. The clash of metal rang out as Marcus deflected Lord Reginald's attack. The older man was driven by desperation and fury, but Marcus was younger, stronger, and professionally trained in combat. Within seconds, he had disarmed Lord Reginald and wrestled him to the ground. Other guards quickly rushed in to help restrain the would-be assassin. Lord Reginald continued to struggle and shout threats, but he was completely overpowered. The dagger lay harmlessly on the floor, its threat neutralized by Marcus's quick thinking and brave action. Isabella stood shaking as she realized how close she had come to death. Her uncle had been willing to kill her rather than accept defeat, proving just how dangerous and unstable he truly was. If Marcus hadn't been there, if he hadn't been watching so carefully, she might not have survived to claim her rightful throne. The judge, who had also been shaken by the violent attack, quickly called for order. "Lord Reginald, you are now under arrest not only for fraud and forgery but also for attempted murder of the royal heir. You will be held without bail pending trial for these serious crimes." As the guards dragged Lord Reginald away, he continued screaming threats and accusations. "This isn't over. I have supporters who will never accept her rule. She's too weak to lead. The kingdom will fall under her leadership." But his words fell on deaf ears. Everyone in the courtroom had just witnessed his true character, a man willing to commit murder to gain power. Whatever legitimate concerns people might have had about Isabella's youth and inexperience were completely overshadowed by the obvious fact that Lord Reginald was violent and untrustworthy. Dr. Harrison quietly packed up his equipment, satisfied that justice had been served. Several court officials approached him to thank him for his crucial testimony and to ensure he would be available for Lord Reginald's criminal trial. Marcus remained close to Isabella, still concerned about her safety even though the immediate threat had passed. "Your Highness, are you all right? That was a very close call." Isabella nodded, though she was still trembling slightly. "I'm fine, thanks to you." Once again, you've protected me when I needed it most." The judge made some final procedural announcements about the formal transfer of royal authority to Isabella. There would be additional ceremonies and paperwork required, but the legal question of succession had been definitively resolved in her favor. As people began filing out of the courtroom, many of them stopped to congratulate Isabella or express their relief that the truth had finally come to light. Several nobles who had remained neutral during the trial now approached to pledge their support to the newly confirmed heir. In the weeks following the trial, Isabella's life changed dramatically as she prepared to officially become queen. The palace, which had felt cold and unwelcoming during the legal battle, was now bustling with activity as advisors, diplomats, and government officials worked to prepare for her coronation. Marcus had been promoted to captain of the royal guard in recognition of his loyalty and quick thinking during the attack. Isabella had insisted on this promotion, knowing that she needed people she could trust completely in positions of authority. The new title came with additional responsibilities, but Marcus was proud to serve the royal family in this expanded role. Dr. Harrison had become something of a celebrity after his crucial testimony. Newspapers across the kingdom had written stories about the handwriting expert who had exposed the royal fraud. Several universities had offered him teaching positions, and he had received requests to examine suspicious documents from courts in neighboring countries. Lord Reginald, meanwhile, was awaiting trial in the royal prison. The charges against him were serious: fraud, forgery, and attempted murder of the royal heir. His lawyers were trying to negotiate a plea bargain, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Most legal experts predicted he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Professor Sterling had disappeared completely after his connection to the forged documents was revealed. Authorities were searching for him, but he seemed to have fled the kingdom entirely. There were rumors that he had been spotted in distant countries, but nothing had been confirmed. Isabella was working hard to learn everything she needed to know about ruling a kingdom. She spent her days meeting with experienced advisors who taught her about economics, diplomacy, military strategy, and the countless other skills required for effective leadership. Despite her youth, she showed remarkable intelligence and determination in mastering these complex subjects. One of Isabella's first official acts was to establish a new position called the Royal Truth Investigator. This person would be responsible for verifying the authenticity of important documents and investigating claims of fraud in government proceedings. She offered the position to Dr. Harrison, who accepted with enthusiasm. "I want to make sure that what happened with my uncle never happens again," Isabella explained to her council of advisors. "People should be able to trust that their government operates with honesty and integrity." Marcus often accompanied Isabella to these meetings, both for security purposes and because she valued his practical perspective on various issues. His years of military service and his understanding of how ordinary people lived gave him insights that complemented the knowledge of the more academic advisors. During one of these planning sessions, Isabella received disturbing news from the kingdom's intelligence network. A messenger arrived with reports that some of Lord Reginald's former supporters were meeting secretly in remote locations. There were rumors that they were planning some kind of action to challenge Isabella's authority. "Do we know who is leading these meetings?" Isabella asked the intelligence officer. "We believe it's Lord Blackthorne, who was one of your uncle's closest allies during the trial," the officer replied. "He's been contacting other nobles who were disappointed by the trial's outcome." Marcus frowned as he considered this information. "Lord Blackthorne is ambitious and has significant resources. If he's organizing opposition to your highness, we need to take it seriously." Isabella felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Just when she thought the challenges were behind her, new threats were emerging. "What kind of action do you think they might be planning?" The intelligence officer hesitated before answering. "We're not certain, Your Highness. They might be planning legal challenges to your coronation, or they could be considering more direct action. We're working to gather more specific information." Isabella realized that becoming queen would mean facing these kinds of threats regularly. There would always be people who disagreed with her decisions or who wanted power for themselves. The difference now was that she had loyal supporters like Marcus and Dr. Harrison to help her face these challenges. "I want to increase security around the palace and at all official events," Isabella decided. "But I also want to reach out to some of the nobles who might be wavering in their support." Perhaps we can address their concerns before they join any organized opposition. Marcus nodded approvingly. That's wise, Your Highness. It's better to prevent problems than to fight them after they develop. Over the following days, Isabella began a careful campaign to strengthen her support among the nobility. She invited potentially troublesome nobles to private meetings where she could address their concerns directly. Many of them had been worried about her youth and inexperience, but they were impressed by her intelligence and her willingness to listen to different viewpoints. Some of the nobles admitted that they had initially supported Lord Reginald because they genuinely believed an older, more experienced ruler would be better for the kingdom. Now that they had seen Lord Reginald's true character, they were embarrassed about their earlier judgment. Your Highness, said Lady Margaret, one of the kingdom's most influential nobles, I owe you an apology. I allowed my concerns about your age to blind me to your uncle's obvious flaws. Your handling of this entire situation has shown wisdom beyond your years. Isabella accepted these apologies graciously, understanding that building a stable government required forgiveness and cooperation rather than holding grudges against everyone who had initially opposed her. Meanwhile, Marcus was working with the intelligence network to gather more information about Lord Blackthorn's activities. They discovered that he had been spreading rumors about Isabella's mental stability, claiming that the stress of the trial had damaged her ability to think clearly. He's trying to create doubt about your fitness to rule, Marcus reported to Isabella. It's similar to what your uncle attempted, but more subtle. Instead of claiming he has a better legal right to the throne, Blackthorn is suggesting that you're psychologically unfit for the responsibilities of leadership. Isabella felt angry that people were still trying to undermine her, but she was also relieved that this new challenge seemed less dangerous than her uncle's violent approach. How should we respond to these rumors? I think the best response is simply to demonstrate your competence through your actions, Marcus suggested. If you continue making good decisions and showing strong leadership, the rumors will lose their effectiveness. Dr. Harrison, who had been listening to their conversation, had another suggestion. Your Highness, you might also consider making some public appearances where people can see you interacting confidently with various challenges. If citizens can observe your leadership skills directly, they'll be less likely to believe negative rumors. Isabella liked this idea. She began scheduling visits to different parts of the kingdom, meeting with farmers, merchants, and ordinary families to understand their concerns and needs. These visits proved to be very successful. People were impressed by her genuine interest in their problems and her practical approach to finding solutions. During one visit to a farming community that had been struggling with crop failures, Isabella worked with local leaders to develop a plan for improving irrigation and crop rotation techniques. Her willingness to get involved in detailed problem-solving showed that she was serious about being an effective ruler rather than just a ceremonial figure. Word of these successful visits spread throughout the kingdom, and Isabella's popularity began to grow significantly. Even some of the nobles who had been meeting with Lord Blackthorn started to reconsider their opposition to her rule. The day of Isabella's coronation arrived with perfect spring weather. The sun shone brightly over the kingdom as thousands of citizens gathered outside the great cathedral to witness the ceremony that would officially make their young princess into their queen. Inside the cathedral, nobles, foreign dignitaries, and government officials filled every seat. The ancient building, with its soaring arches and magnificent stained glass windows, provided a suitably majestic setting for the historic occasion. Isabella had chosen to wear her mother's coronation gown, which had been carefully preserved and altered to fit her smaller frame. Marcus stood in his position as captain of the royal guard, wearing his finest dress uniform with the new insignia of his rank gleaming on his chest. He felt immensely proud as he watched Isabella prepare for the ceremony. The frightened girl who had signed desperately for his help in the courtroom had grown into a confident young woman ready to accept the enormous responsibilities of leadership. Dr. Harrison was also present as the newly appointed Royal Truth Investigator, sitting in a place of honor near the front of the cathedral. His presence served as a reminder of how Isabella had fought for justice and truth against those who would have stolen her rightful place through deception. As Isabella walked down the long aisle toward the altar, she thought about all the challenges she had overcome to reach this moment. Her father's death, her uncle's treachery, the terrifying trial, and the attempt on her life. Each obstacle had tested her strength and determination. but she had survived them all. The archbishop began the ancient coronation ceremony, speaking words that had been used for hundreds of years to install new rulers. When the moment came for Isabella to take her oath, her voice rang out clearly and confidently through the cathedral. I, Isabella, do solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom according to their respective laws and customs. I will cause justice and mercy to be executed in all my judgments. I will maintain the peace and security of the realm, and I will protect the rights and freedoms of all citizens. As the golden crown was placed upon her head, Isabella felt the weight of her new responsibilities settling on her shoulders, but she also felt the strength that came from knowing she had loyal supporters who believed in her ability to lead wisely and justly. The crowd outside erupted in cheers when the cathedral bells began ringing to announce that the coronation was complete. Isabella appeared on the cathedral steps wearing her crown and royal robes, waving to the thousands of people who had come to celebrate with her. In the weeks that followed, Queen Isabella's reign began in earnest. Lord Blackthorn's opposition movement had collapsed after most nobles decided to support the new queen instead of joining his conspiracy. Faced with his complete lack of support, Blackthorn had eventually fled the kingdom rather than face charges for his seditious activities. Isabella established herself quickly as a capable and caring ruler. She implemented new programs to help farmers improve their harvests, created better trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms, and reformed the legal system to prevent the kind of fraud her uncle had attempted. Marcus remained her closest advisor and protector, always watching for signs of new threats while also offering practical wisdom about various policy decisions. Their partnership, which had begun with secret hand signals in a desperate courtroom, had evolved into one of the most trusted relationships in the kingdom. Dr. Harrison proved to be excellent in his role as royal truth investigator. He established new procedures for verifying important documents and trained other experts in the latest techniques for detecting forgeries. His work helped restore public confidence in the government's integrity. 1 year after her coronation, Isabella received news that Lord Reginald had died in prison while awaiting his final sentencing. Despite everything he had done to her, she felt sad about his death. She ordered that he be buried with dignity in the royal cemetery, believing that even those who had wronged her deserved some measure of forgiveness in death. Professor Sterling was eventually captured in a distant country and brought back to stand trial for his role in the document forgery. He confessed to his crimes and provided details about how Lord Reginald had recruited him for the scheme. His testimony helped authorities understand the full extent of the conspiracy and implement better safeguards against similar frauds in the future. As Isabella's second year as queen began, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying day in the courtroom when she had desperately signaled to Marcus for help. The frightened 16-year-old girl had become a confident ruler who was respected both by her own people and by leaders of other kingdoms. The secret sign language that Marcus had taught her as a child had saved not only her life but the future of the entire kingdom. Without their ability to communicate silently in that crowded courtroom, Lord Reginald's fraud might never have been exposed. Isabella often thought about the importance of having people you could trust completely. Marcus had risked his career and possibly his life to help her prove the truth. Dr. Harrison had put his reputation on the line to expose the forgeries. Even Mrs. Pembridge had provided quiet support during the darkest days of the crisis. On the anniversary of the trial, Isabella established a new royal tradition. Each year, she would personally thank the people who had helped her during her time of greatest need. Marcus received a special medal recognizing his loyalty and courage. Dr. Harrison was honored for his commitment to truth and justice. Even the court clerks who had helped bring his equipment into the courtroom received recognition for their assistance. A ruler is only as strong as the people who support them, Isabella told the gathered crowd during the ceremony. I learned that lesson when I was very young, and I will never forget it. Marcus stood proudly beside the queen as she spoke, remembering the scared princess who had used hand signals to ask for his help. That simple gesture had led to one of the most dramatic exposures of fraud in the kingdom's history. The story of the young girl who flashed a hidden sign to her royal guard became legendary throughout the kingdom. Parents told it to their children as an example of how courage and cleverness could triumph over deception and greed. The tale reminded everyone that even in the darkest circumstances, There was always hope if you had the wisdom to trust the right people and the courage to fight for what was right. Queen Isabella ruled wisely for many years, always remembering the lessons she had learned during her uncle's betrayal. She never forgot that power belonged to the people, not to those who would steal it through lies and violence, and she never forgot the importance of surrounding herself with people of integrity who would stand by her when facing difficult challenges. The secret sign that had once saved a kingdom became a symbol of the trust and communication that made strong leadership possible. Isabella's reign was remembered as a time when truth prevailed over deception, and when a young woman's courage had protected the future of everyone she was sworn to serve.